At 0730 hours on November 19, 1942, Soviet artillery commander Marshal Nikolai Voronov stood in an observation post 15 miles northwest of Stalingrad, watching the second hand on his watch approach the moment when 3,500 Soviet guns would open fire simultaneously. The artillery was arranged in unprecedented concentration, one gun every 15 yards along an 80-mile front. The bombardment would last 80 minutes and would fire more shells in that time than the entire Russian army had fired during the first 6 months of World War I. The target was the Romanian Third Army holding defensive positions along the Don River northwest of Stalingrad. The Romanians had been in position for 3 months, occupying trenches the Soviets had abandoned during the German advance in August. The positions were adequate but not strong. The Romanians lacked concrete bunkers, deep dugouts, or reinforced command posts. Their defenses were fieldworks, trenches, firing positions, wire obstacles, minefields, sufficient to stop infantry assault, inadequate to withstand concentrated artillery bombardment. At 0730 hours precisely, Voronov gave the order. 3,500 guns fired. The sound was beyond anything human experience could describe. Witnesses 50 miles away heard the bombardment as continuous rolling thunder. Men standing in the observation post felt pressure waves from the massed firing. The ground shook continuously as thousands of guns fired at maximum rate. The shells fell on Romanian positions in devastating concentration. High explosive shells detonated in trenches, collapsing walls, burying defenders. Fragmentation shells burst above positions, sending shrapnel through exposed troops. The bombardment was not precision fire directed at specific targets. It was area saturation designed to destroy everything in a defined zone. Every square meter of Romanian forward positions received multiple shell impacts. Defensive positions ceased to exist as organized structures. They became crater fields filled with debris, unexploded ordnance, and dead or wounded defenders. After 80 minutes, the artillery shifted fire to rear areas. Soviet infantry and armor advanced across no man's land and into Romanian positions, encountering minimal resistance. Defenders who survived the bombardment were stunned, disoriented, unable to mount coordinated defense. Romanian units that attempted to fight were bypassed. Soviet forces moved through gaps around strongpoints, exploiting success rather than reducing resistance. This was the northern arm of Operation Uranus, the Soviet strategic offensive designed to encircle the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. 350 miles south, a second Soviet force was preparing identical assault against the Romanian Fourth Army south of Stalingrad. The two forces would drive toward each other, meeting approximately 60 miles west of Stalingrad at Calach-on-Don. When they met, approximately 250,000 German and Romanian troops would be trapped in a pocket with their backs to Stalingrad and the Volga River. The operation had been planned in absolute secrecy for 6 weeks. German intelligence had detected some Soviet preparations but had underestimated their scale and misidentified their objectives. German commanders believed the Soviets were planning local counterattacks to relieve pressure on Stalingrad. They did not anticipate strategic encirclement operation involving over 1 million troops, 13,500 guns, 900 tanks, and 100 aircraft. This intelligence failure would cost Germany the war's momentum and lead ultimately to defeat at Stalingrad, the first major German operational failure on the Eastern Front and the psychological turning point from which Germany never recovered. The strategic situation at Stalingrad in November 1942 reflected 4 months of grinding urban combat. German forces had entered Stalingrad in September 1942 with orders to capture the city and secure the western bank of the Volga River. The capture would cut Soviet supply lines along the river, secure Germany's flank for operations toward the Caucasus oil fields, and provide a symbolic victory by taking the city named after Stalin. But capturing Stalingrad proved far more difficult than German commanders anticipated. The Soviet 62nd Army under General Vasily Chukov defended with tactics specifically designed for urban warfare, small unit actions, night raids, close-quarters combat that negated German advantages in artillery and air support. The fighting reduced Stalingrad to rubble, transforming the city into a landscape of destroyed buildings, rubble piles, and defensive positions constructed from debris. By November 1942, German forces controlled approximately 90% of Stalingrad, but could not eliminate the final Soviet positions along the riverbank. The 62nd Army held a strip approximately 12 miles long and less than 1 mile deep, supplied at night by ferries crossing the Volga under artillery fire. German commanders committed more forces attempting to eliminate these positions, additional infantry divisions, more artillery, continuous air bombardment. The commitment consumed resources and focused German attention entirely on the city. This focus created vulnerability elsewhere along the front. The German Sixth Army at Stalingrad was the spearhead of a salient extending 300 miles east from German main defensive lines. The flanks of this salient were held by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces, allied armies that were less well-equipped, less well-trained, and less motivated than German units. Soviet intelligence had identified these flanks as weak points where breakthrough was possible. Soviet planning for Operation Uranus began in September 1942 when General Georgy Zhukov, Deputy Supreme Commander of Soviet Forces, and Colonel General Alexander Vasilevsky, Chief of the General Staff, met with Stalin to propose strategic counteroffensive. Their plan was ambitious, simultaneous attacks north and south of Stalingrad, would break through Axis defensive positions, drive westward, and encircle German forces in Stalingrad before they could withdraw. The plan required assembling overwhelming force at breakthrough points while concealing preparations from German reconnaissance. Soviet forces would need numerical superiority of approximately 3-1 at breakthrough sectors, sufficient artillery concentration to destroy defensive positions, and enough armor to exploit breakthrough before German reserves could respond. The operation required moving hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of vehicles, and millions of artillery shells to attack positions without alerting German intelligence. Soviet deception operations were comprehensive. Troop movements occurred at night. Vehicles traveled without lights on roads, camouflaged with trees and brush. Artillery was positioned in pre-prepared positions concealed from aerial observation. Radio silence was enforced strictly. False radio traffic was broadcast suggesting concentrations in different sectors. Dummy tanks were positioned where German reconnaissance might observe them. Every measure supported the deception that Soviet preparations were for local attacks rather than strategic offensive. German intelligence detected some Soviet buildup but failed to recognize its scale. Reports identified increased activity along the Don River, northwest of Stalingrad, and south of the city near the Kalmyk steppe. But German analysts concluded the activity represented defensive preparations or local counterattacks, not strategic offensive. This assessment was based partly on intelligence gaps and partly on assumptions that Soviet forces had insufficient strength for major operations after 5 months of defensive combat. The assumptions were catastrophically wrong. Soviet industry had been producing tanks, artillery, and aircraft at rates far exceeding German intelligence estimates. Reserves from Siberia and Central Asia had arrived. Training programs had produced replacements for casualties. By November 1942, Soviet forces were stronger than at any point since June 1941, while German forces were weaker after 17 months of combat without adequate replacements. The Northern Attack Group for Operation Uranus was designated the Southwest Front under General Nikolai Vatutin. It comprised 3 armies, 5th Tank Army, 21st Army, and 65th Army, totaling approximately 400,000 troops, 900 tanks, and 100 guns. These forces assembled northwest of Stalingrad during October and early November, concealed in forests and ravines along the Don River. The Southern Attack Group was designated the Stalingrad Front under Colonel General Andrei Yeremenko. It comprised 2 armies, 57th Army and 51st Army, totaling approximately 340,000 troops, 600 tanks, and 900 guns. These forces assembled south of Stalingrad in the Kalmyk steppe, concealed by terrain and distance from German observation points. Both attack groups faced similar defensive arrangements. Axis defenses consisted of Romanian armies holding frontline positions with German units in reserve behind them. The Romanian forces were equipped primarily with weapons captured from Poland, France, and Czechoslovakia, rather than German production. Their anti-tank weapons were obsolete, consisting mostly of 37mm guns ineffective against Soviet T-34 tanks. Their artillery was miscellaneous calibers requiring different ammunition types that complicated logistics. More critically, Romanian morale was questionable. Romanian soldiers understood they were fighting to protect Germany's flank for operations that benefited Germany rather than Romania. Many resented being positioned in exposed sectors while German forces concentrated at Stalingrad. Desertion rates were high. Officers reported disciplinary problems. The units were adequate for static defense but unreliable under sustained attack. German intelligence recognized these problems but had no solution. German forces were committed at Stalingrad and in the Caucasus. No reserves existed to replace Romanian units with German troops. German commanders accepted the risk of weak flanks because eliminating Soviet positions at Stalingrad seemed more important than protecting against hypothetical Soviet offensives. The northern offensive began at 07:30 hours on November 19th, as described at the beginning of this narrative. After the 80-minute artillery bombardment, Soviet infantry of the 21st and 65th Armies advanced across Romanian defensive zones. Resistance was sporadic and uncoordinated. Romanian units that attempted to fight were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. By noon on November 19th, Soviet forces had penetrated 8 to 10 miles into Romanian positions. At 1100 hours, Soviet armor committed. The 5th Tank Army, consisting of 2 tank corps and 1 cavalry corps, approximately 500 tanks and 40,000 troops, drove through the breakthrough sectors heading southwest toward Calaci-on-Don. The tank advance bypassed Romanian strongpoints ignored, flanking threats maintained momentum toward the encirclement objective. German doctrine emphasized eliminating threats to flanks before advancing. Soviet doctrine emphasized exploiting success regardless of flanks, accepting risk in pursuit of operational objectives. By nightfall on November 19th, Soviet forces had advanced 25 miles, had shattered Romanian defensive positions across 80-mile front, and had penetrated into German rear areas where supply depots, headquarters units, and communication centers were undefended. Panic spread through German rear area units as reports arrived of Soviet tanks appearing where no enemy forces were supposed to exist. The southern offensive began at 1000 hours on November 20th with similar artillery bombardment, followed by infantry and armor assault. The Romanian 4th Army offered slightly better resistance than the 3rd Army. Some units fought for several hours before being overwhelmed, but the outcome was identical. By nightfall, November 20th, Soviet southern forces had advanced 30 miles, had broken through Romanian defenses, and were driving northwest toward Calaci to meet the northern forces. German commanders recognized the crisis by November 20th but disagreed about response. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding 6th Army at Stalingrad, requested permission to withdraw from the city and fight his way westward to avoid encirclement. Adolf Hitler refused, ordering 6th Army to hold Stalingrad and counterattack to restore defensive lines. The order was operationally impossible. 6th Army was committed to urban combat at Stalingrad and could not disengage while under pressure. The Romanian armies on the flanks were disintegrating. Soviet forces were already in German rear areas. Withdrawal required organized retreat under pressure across open terrain against mobile enemy forces. The maneuver would have been difficult even with preparation. Without preparation under surprise attack, it was impractical. The alternative was to accept encirclement and await relief. German commanders estimated that 6th Army could hold defensive perimeter around Stalingrad for several weeks if supplied by air. Luftwaffe commanders claimed they could deliver 500 tons of supplies daily to Stalingrad, sufficient to sustain 6 divisions indefinitely. This estimate was optimistic to the point of fantasy, but it provided justification for Hitler's order to hold positions. Soviet northern and southern forces met on November 23rd at Calaci-on-Don, 60 miles west of Stalingrad. Advanced units of the 26th Tank Corps from the north encountered advanced units of the 4th Mechanized Corps from the south at 16:30 hours. The meeting point was a bridge over the Don River. Soviet tankers from both forces embraced, photographed together, celebrated completing the encirclement. Inside the pocket were approximately 250,000 Axis troops, 20 German divisions, and 2 Romanian divisions of the 6th Army plus supporting units. These forces occupied an area roughly 30 miles east-west and 25 miles north-south, with their backs to Stalingrad and the Volga River. The perimeter was approximately 100 miles long. Defending that perimeter against Soviet forces attacking from all directions while maintaining operations inside Stalingrad was beyond 6th Army's capabilities. But Hitler's orders were absolute. Hold Stalingrad. Await relief. Do not attempt breakout. 6th Army would remain in the pocket supplied by air until German forces outside the pocket launched offensive to break through Soviet encirclement and restore land communication. The airlift began on November 24th. Luftwaffe transport aircraft, primarily Junkers, U-52s and some Heinkel, He-111 bombers, converted to transport role, flew supplies into airfields at Pitomnik and Gumrak inside the Stalingrad pocket. The initial flights delivered ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. The plan was to deliver 500 tons daily, sufficient for 6 divisions operating at reduced combat tempo. The plan failed immediately. Luftwaffe transport aircraft available totaled approximately 500 aircraft, far fewer than the 700-800 required to deliver 500 tons daily, allowing for weather maintenance and combat losses. Soviet fighter aircraft attacked transport aircraft continuously. Soviet anti-aircraft guns positioned around the pocket created defensive zones that transports had to cross. Weather was terrible snow fog icing conditions that grounded aircraft for days. Daily deliveries averaged 100 tons, 1/5 of requirements. 6th Army began starving. Food rations decreased weekly. Raw ammunition was rationed. Medical supplies were exhausted. Wounded soldiers died from treatable injuries because antibiotics and plasma were unavailable. Frostbite casualties mounted as winter temperatures dropped below 0 Fahrenheit and soldiers lacked adequate clothing. By December 6th, Army's combat effectiveness was degrading rapidly. Units were understrength from casualties and disease. Ammunition was insufficient for sustained combat. Fuel for vehicles was nearly exhausted, immobilizing armor and artillery. The Army was dying slowly while holding positions that had no strategic value beyond Hitler's orders. German relief efforts began in mid-December. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein commanding the newly created Army Group. Dawn assembled forces for Operation Winter Storm, an offensive designed to break through Soviet encirclement and reach 6th Army. The relief force consisted primarily of 4th Panzer Army under General Hermann Hoth, approximately 230 tanks and 4 infantry divisions. The offensive launched on December 12th from positions 75 miles southwest of the Stalingrad pocket. The plan was to drive northeast, penetrate Soviet encirclement lines, establish corridor to 6th Army, then either evacuate 6th Army through the corridor or reinforce them sufficiently to hold expanded perimeter. The operation was Germany's last realistic chance to avoid catastrophe at Stalingrad. The offensive initially succeeded. German forces advanced 40 miles in 4 days, reaching positions only 35 miles from the pocket. But Soviet reserves counterattacked, and the German advance stalled. Hoth requested that 6th Army break out toward his position, covering the remaining 35 miles from inside the pocket. Paulus requested permission from Hitler to attempt breakout. Hitler refused. 6th Army would remain in position. The relief force would continue advancing, but the relief force could not continue. Soviet counterattacks threatened to encircle the relief force itself. On December 23rd, Hoth began withdrawing to avoid catastrophe. The relief attempt had failed. 6th Army would not be rescued. Throughout December and January, 6th Army's situation deteriorated. The airlift continued delivering inadequate supplies. Soviet forces compressed the pocket, capturing the outlying airfields, forcing Luftwaffe aircraft to use the single remaining airfield at Gumrak. When Gumrak fell on January 22nd, the airlift ceased. 6th Army was completely isolated. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. The promotion was a cynical gesture. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide rather than surrender, setting an example for the garrison. Paulus recognized the intended message and ignored it. On January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered the southern portion of the pocket. On February 2nd, the northern portion surrendered. Approximately 91,000 German and Romanian soldiers entered Soviet captivity. Approximately 150,000 had died during the encirclement from combat, starvation, disease, and cold. Of the 91,000 prisoners, only approximately 6,000 survived Soviet captivity to return to Germany after the war. Operation Uranus succeeded completely. Soviet forces encircled and destroyed an entire German army, captured or killed approximately 300,000 Axis troops, eliminated 22 divisions from German order of battle, and demonstrated that Wehrmacht could be defeated operationally despite tactical proficiency. The victory at Stalingrad shifted psychological momentum. After Stalingrad, Soviet forces advanced. German forces retreated. The Eastern Front would not stabilize again until Germany collapsed in 1945. The operation's success reflected several factors. First, Soviet operational planning was sophisticated and competently executed. The concentration of forces at breakthrough points, the artillery bombardment, the exploitation by armor, the timing of both attacks to prevent German response all reflected improved Soviet military capability compared to 1941. Second, German intelligence failure allowed Soviets to achieve surprise. German commanders expected local counterattacks, not strategic encirclement. This expectation influenced deployments, reserves, positioning, and response planning. When the actual Soviet offensive began, German forces were positioned incorrectly and could not respond effectively. Third, German operational inflexibility prevented effective response even after the encirclement occurred. Hitler's refusal to authorize breakout, his insistence on holding Stalingrad, regardless of cost, his belief that air power could sustain encircled forces, these decisions transformed tactical defeat into strategic catastrophe. A competent commander would have ordered immediate breakout on November 21st when encirclement was imminent. Sixth Army might have suffered heavy casualties during breakout but would have escaped destruction. Fourth, German logistics could not support operations at this scale. The airlift required to sustain Sixth Army was beyond Luftwaffe capabilities. The forces required to relieve Sixth Army exceeded available reserves. Germany was fighting war of attrition against opponent with superior resources, and attrition favored the opponent. The strategic consequences extended beyond Stalingrad. Germany lost 22 divisions, including elite formations that could not be replaced. Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian forces suffered devastating casualties that reduced their willingness to commit forces to Eastern Front operations. German reserves were exhausted attempting relief operations. The defeat convinced neutrals, including Turkey, that Germany might lose the war, reducing likelihood of their joining Axis. Most importantly, Stalingrad demonstrated that Soviet Union could conduct strategic operations successfully. The 1941 Soviet performance had been catastrophic, with millions of casualties and thousands of tanks lost. By late 1942, Soviet forces could plan complex operations, achieve surprise, concentrate overwhelming force at decisive points, and exploit success before enemy could respond. This operational competence would only improve as war continued. German responses to Stalingrad varied. Some commanders recognized the defeat signaled inevitable German defeat and attempted to negotiate exit from war. Others concluded that victory required total mobilization and increased ruthlessness. Hitler chose the latter path, ordering total war measures and increased brutality against partisan activity and civilian populations. These measures prolonged the war but made defeat more certain and more costly. Post-war Soviet historiography portrayed Operation Uranus as evidence of Stalin's strategic genius and Soviet military superiority. This interpretation was propaganda. Stalin had made catastrophic decisions in 1941-1942 that nearly destroyed Soviet Union. Operation Uranus succeeded despite Stalin's interference, not because of his leadership. The actual architects, Zhukov and Vasilevsky, planned the operation and executed it while managing Stalin's expectations and demands. Western historiography often portrays Stalingrad as turning point of World War II. This interpretation is partially correct. Stalingrad was psychological turning point where German aura of invincibility was destroyed, But operational turning point had occurred earlier when German offensives in summer 1942 failed to achieve decisive results before Soviet reserves arrived. By November 1942, Germany had already lost strategic initiative. Stalingrad confirmed the loss rather than causing it. Modern military analysis of Operation Uranus focuses on operational art. The operation demonstrated how to plan and execute encirclement operations, achieve surprise through deception, concentrate overwhelming force at breakthrough points, exploit success, ruthlessly accept risk to flanks in pursuit of operational objectives. These principles became foundational to Soviet operational doctrine and influenced Western military thinking during Cold War. The operation also demonstrated importance of intelligence. German failure to detect Soviet preparations created conditions for surprise. Soviet deception operations successfully misled German intelligence about scale and objectives. The intelligence failure was not single mistake, but systemic problem reflecting German assumptions about Soviet capabilities. Finally, Operation Uranus demonstrated that strategic decisions matter more than tactical excellence. German forces at Stalingrad fought skillfully at tactical level, achieving impressive kill ratios and defending positions tenaciously. But strategic decisions, committing forces to Stalingrad, accepting weak flanks, refusing permission to withdraw, created conditions where tactical excellence was irrelevant. Superior strategy defeated superior tactics. Operation Uranus. November 1923, 1942. Soviet forces approximately 1 million troops, 13,500 guns, 1 all-in 450 tanks, 1 with 350 aircraft. Axis forces approximately 1.1 million troops, 200 guns, 675 tanks, 1 all 216 aircraft. Casualties approximately 300,000 Axis troops killed or captured, including entire German 6th Army. Soviet casualties approximately 155,000 killed or wounded, acceptable cost for strategic victory that changed war's trajectory. The pincers that closed at Kalach on November 23, trapping 250,000 troops in pocket. They could not escape, supplied by airlift that could not sustain them, awaiting relief that never came. The encirclement that sealed German fate at Stalingrad and demonstrated that Wehrmacht could be defeated, that Soviet Union could conduct strategic operations successfully, that Germany's path led inevitably to defeat, despite tactical proficiency and soldiers' courage. The brilliant Soviet strategy that transformed defensive struggle at Stalingrad into strategic victory, that destroyed entire army through operational maneuver rather than tactical combat, that demonstrated the superiority of good strategy over good tactics, of operational excellence over tactical skill, of strategic thinking over narrow focus on immediate objectives. The counteroffensive that changed the war by proving Germany could be beaten, that Soviet forces could think and fight at operational level, that numbers and industry and strategic depth mattered more than individual battles, and that Hitler's decisions would lead Germany to destruction regardless of how well German soldiers fought at tactical level.